Welcome to today's webinar, Strategies to Improve Reproduction During Heat Stress in Dairy Cattle, being presented by Dr. Todd Bilsby. Today's webinar is presented by DairyXnet and the National Association of County Agricultural Agents, and we are very proud to present a series of 4 webinars on heat stress. DairyXnet is a national extension-driven web resource for those of you that are not familiar with DairyXnet. It is designed to meet the educational and decision-making needs of dairy producers, allied industry partners, extension educators, and consumers. Today's webinar, Strategies to Improve Reproduction During Summer Heat Stress, as I say, is presented by Todd Bilsby. He was raised on a farm in northwestern Missouri. He received his bachelor's from Oklahoma State University, a master's from the University of Arkansas, and a PhD from the University of Florida in nutritional and reproductive physiology. Dr. Bilsby currently has both an extension and research appointment with Texas A&M AgriLife. His research efforts focus on improving fertility in the modern-day dairy cow, but this includes but is not limited to refining synchronization protocols, improving summer fertility through nutritional and cooling strategies, and embryo manipulation and reduction of early embryonic death. We're very happy to have Dr. Bilsby here with us today to talk about strategies to improve reproduction during heat stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amaral Phillips. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this webinar today and to give this talk. As Dr. Phillips mentioned, this is part of a series of talks that are going to be given through a grant that we received from the USDA AFRI. So with that, I am not going to talk about cooling strategies, for instance. And we know that cooling is the #1 way to improve fertility and milk production during the summer months. I'm going to focus more on what are some other strategies that we might want to consider to employ on our dairies specifically for the summer months to improve fertility. So we know heat stress can occur all across the U.S. Sometimes when I'm speaking up in the very northern parts of the U.S., I get questioned, well, we don't really get heat stress up here, or why would we want to make these changes? We don't really see the effects of heat stress like y'all do in the South. And I would beg to differ. The first question I ask is, does your milk production go down any in the summer? And if they say yes, then they're experiencing heat stress. And I've never had anyone say no to that. Another thing that I get questioned is, well, it's not as severe as it is in the South. And so that is true. However, things such as short heat waves that occur across the U.S., it doesn't have to be a month or 2 months or 3 months of heat stress to have the negative effects. The negative effects on reproduction and milk production can happen within a couple of days. For example, I was living in the Central Valley of California when the heat wave in 2006 came through and lost a dynamic group of animals, and milk and animals were lost of upwards of $1 billion. And that heat wave was only probably 8 to 10 days long. Another heat wave in 1999, just for 2 days in Nebraska, they lost $20 million in cattle deaths and performance losses. Iowa, in a 2-day time period in 1995, they lost 3,700 animals to cattle deaths. And then New York, which is generally a climate that you would consider as not as heat stress as somewhere like obviously the South or Southwest, but they continue to lose annually upwards of $20 million. So this cost the U.S. Dairy industry somewhere has been estimated around $900 million. And again shows that heat stress occurs all across the U.S. and it doesn't have to be a month long or 2 months long, but the negative effects of heat stress can happen within a couple of days. And within a couple of days, on reproduction, when it comes to reproduction and specifically, when you get the heat stress effects that affect the quality of the egg, it usually takes close to 2 months, about 40 to 50 days before that animal is ovulating a good quality egg for that you could breed to and possibly get an embryo. So keep that in mind, that once we have these heat stress effects that occur, it's usually 40 to 50 days before that animal is coming back to normal. And this is why we see a lag in fertility that goes well into our fall months. I know here in Texas, for instance, it's usually well into November, first part of December, before we really see our fertility coming back to normal rates, just due to the fact that once heat stress occurs, it's 40 to 50 days before these animals recover from that detrimental effect. This next slide looks at the effect of milk yield on seasonal variation in pregnancy rate in lactating dairy cows in Florida and Georgia. And what I'd like to point out here is the effects that milk production has. As we have bred this animal to produce copious amounts of milk, we've really created the bovine athlete with our genetic breeding to have high-producing animals. And with that, our animals become more susceptible to heat stress. So if you look here, animals in low producers are in the yellow compared to medium producers in the green and high producers in the red. And as you will see, the higher producing animals obviously take a larger hit in fertility during the summer months versus animals that aren't producing as much milk. Because as we've bred this animal to produce a lot of milk, with that she needs to eat a lot more to support that extra milk production. And so with that you get a higher heat load due to the metabolic heat. So really, as we've produced a high-producing animal, we again need to take further steps to employ strategies to keep these animals cooler, and normally keep them cooler at a much lower temperature than once thought. I'm going to step through a few slides showing the effects that heat stress has on different aspects of the early growing embryo, and how this really affects our fertility. And towards the end of my talk, I will get into some strategies with embryo manipulation and transfer and how to bypass these. But starting off with fertilization rate in lactating dairy cows, this is a study done by Sartori in 2002. And you can see animals that were not heat stressed, we receive about an 85 to 90% fertilization rate, meaning this sperm successfully binds with the ovulated egg. However, if these animals are heat stressed, that fertilization rate now can drop as low as around 50 to 55%. So because we're ovulating, that cow would be ovulating an already damaged egg from heat stress, this severely can reduce our fertilization rate. So taking this a step further and looking at embryo developments from day 1 after fertilization up to days 7 through 9, this is just the different stages of embryo development and where within the uterus or oviduct this embryo is at that time. And we know from studies done at the University of Florida, specifically out of Pete Hansen's laboratory, that the first 2 to 3 days of an embryo's life is very susceptible to heat stress. And the embryo is not as equipped as it is later on in life to combat the negative effects of heat stress. So if we can devise strategies to help that early growing embryo to bypass those events, we can possibly greatly improve fertility. Taking this a step further, so I showed you up through days 8 or 9 of embryo development. Now let's look specifically out here around days 15 to 19 of the bovine uterus. As you can tell by the schematic, I am not an artist. However, if you can envision this as a cow's uterus and uterine horns with the ovaries and a CL on those ovaries, and this animal that's producing prostaglandins, if she is open. So if this animal is not pregnant and there's not an embryo within the uterine horns, she produces prostaglandins from that endometrial lining, which will act upon the CL to cause CL regression. However, if the animal is pregnant and there is an embryo available, that embryo produces a very important protein called interferon tau. This interferon tau then blocks this prostaglandin release. That would hopefully maintain the CL. The CL is what produces progesterone, which is very important for pregnancy. And so you would get an elevated levels of progesterone, and you would get a reduction in those prostaglandin spikes that causes that CL to regress. Now this is a very important time point, because if this embryo is either obviously not here, it's not producing interferon tau, or if it's too small or in some way damaged and not producing enough interferon tau to override this prostaglandin production, the animal will go ahead and produce enough prostaglandins to regress the CL. The embryo that is there will be flushed out or aborted, and the animal will come back into heat. So if we can look at strategies specifically during heat stress to help during this time period, it would be beneficial, because we know through studies that the embryos are smaller during summer months at this time, that the amount of interferon tau produced by those smaller embryos is greatly reduced by 71%. And to top it all off, the amount of secretion of prostaglandins from the endometrium is greater during summer. So we have several avenues working against us during this time point, specifically due to heat stress, that can cause this animal to lose the embryo and come back into heat. So if we can look at strategies to block more prostaglandin production or maintain the adequate size of that embryo to produce enough interferon tau to block prostaglandins, we can most likely improve fertility. We know that up to 40% of our total embryonic losses occurs during these time points. Basically, failure of that embryo that's there to maintain the CL. So in some cases, it's not that we can't get the cow pregnant, it's that we can't keep this cow pregnant. And a lot of that disconnect occurs during this time point. So if we want to look at embryo loss, this was adapted from a study out of Spain, looking at early embryo loss at different THI. So THI is the temperature humidity index, which is just a calculation that takes into account temperature and humidity. And we know that THI that used to be a THI of 72 or greater is when our cows become heat stressed. However, University of Arizona has reevaluated that index, and we know now that our high-producing animals are becoming heat stressed even at a cooler temperature, and the THI that we go by now is at 68 THI. But if you look at this for pregnancy loss, shortly after 64 THI, you get a large jump in the amount of embryo loss, and here from 2% up to 8%, and then when it goes above 69, now they've jumped up to even 12%. So most likely reproduction can be compromised at even cooler temperatures than a lot of times of what we even see at milk production. We'll normally take milk production losses might be 15-20%, but if you look at what our reproduction does in the summer, sometimes we'll take as much as 50% or greater. So since we've really bred this animal to produce milk and focus on milk production, you in turn compromise other parts of her, such as her reproduction. In the summer versus winter, we're 3.7 times more likely to lose an embryo and 5.4 times more likely to lose an embryo if it's twins. So what's some strategies that we can do to reduce the negative effects of heat stress? I'm going to go through a few strategies here. I'm going to look at bull breeding versus using synchronization programs. I'm going to look at utilizing synchronization in a full timed AI, no heat detection versus detecting heat. Also, the possibility of inducing accessory CLs to improve progesterone levels. And then last but not least, go through some recent studies that we've done with utilizing in vitro fertilization and embryo manipulation and transfer to improve fertility during summer. So to get into natural service or bull breeding versus timed AI, there really isn't a plethora of research out there looking at heat stress on the bull that's of recent. There are some older studies. This one in particular was in 1963, looking at Holstein bulls, and 3 weeks prior to heat stress, so what they would consider the cut point of 53% initial motility. However, 1 week after heat stress, it has already dropped to 45. 1 to 3 weeks after heat stress, we're now down to 34. And then as far as 7 to 9 weeks after heat stress, we're still at 42%. So this just shows the effects that heat stress has on initial motility. If you then take this on further, and they looked at abnormal spermatozoa, when they started at only 9% abnormal spermatozoa, by 1 to 3 weeks after heat stress, they're still at 53% abnormal spermatozoa, and 7 to 9 weeks, they're still at 29%. When they looked at sperm concentration, you can see a dramatic reduction in sperm concentration here, all the way down to 460, 10 to the 6th here, where spermatozoan concentration has dropped. And so this just brings up the same point that I brought up about the cow, that once the cow gets heat stress, that egg quality, that egg she's going to ovulate that's going to be a normal egg, doesn't come back to normal for 40 to 50 days. The same thing occurs when it comes to the bull and spermatogenesis, where it takes 40, 50, 60 days for this bull to start producing normal motile spermatozoa. So ambient temperatures, they've shown that above 27 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit for as small as 6 hours per day can reduce semen quality dramatically in bulls. And the reason I bring up bull breeding, even though the commercial dairy industry has moved more and more to heavily AI, greater than 95% of our herds are doing some type of AI, there's still a large portion of producers that use bulls as a cleanup program for cleanup bulls, where they might AI for, say, 3 or 4 AIs and then go to a cleanup pen. And with that, I think it needs to be evaluated whether these dairies can spend more time AIing or make more breeding pens if it fits, to where you AI longer, especially in the summer, but it might pay to do it all the time, or get rid of bulls altogether. Show you the next slide. This was in 1985, looking at control versus heat stress. Before they started, during treatment, during this 8-week treatment, you can see motile sperm dramatically drops up till the 8th week. And then when they stopped heat stress, you can see it took almost 8 weeks before it came back to what control levels of animals that were not heat stressed. So again, just showing not only the effect heat stress has on the bull, but the fact that it takes so long for the bull's fertility to come back to normal. I put this slide in here. It's not specifically dealing with heat stress, but just talking about the bull. Dr. Mike Overton did a great job comparing natural service versus AI. There's been other studies looked at this as well, and showing that 60% of the time AI was more profitable than natural service. A lot of this is due to the genetic gain that you receive from a heifer produced from a stick of semen, high quality semen, versus bull breeding. So again, just as something else to consider when utilizing bulls, that your net genetic gain might not be as good as if you're using AI. Again, this isn't specifically looking at summer, just another point that I wanted to make about utilizing bull breeding. So if looking at bulls, we know we get reduced genetic progress, and most studies would show reduced profitability. Of course, we know them to be dangerous, can cause lameness, injury to both people and cows. Bull breeding during heat stress decreases sperm concentration, motility, and increases the number of abnormal sperm. And this does not return to normal for 2 months, just like a cow. So if you're utilizing bull breeding and a cow's in there as well, you've got 2 factors of heat stress. Whereas if you were just using AI, you at least take one of these components out of the picture, the bull that might be heat stressed. So if you're going to use bulls, and I know several farms that have been successful and are successful at utilizing bulls, whether it be in a cleanup or full bull breeding, but they do in a very aggressive bull management program. They really rotate these bulls, use young bulls, they use breeding soundness exams, and make sure they have proper vaccinations, etc. And so if you're going to utilize bulls, make sure you're doing all the proper steps to ensure a proper bull management. At the end, you can take bull out of the picture and bypass the negative effects by using AI. Quite possibly, If you can, on a commercial dairy, there's ways where you can look at the last AI. So let's say they're doing 3 AIs and then they go to a cleanup bull. Look at the fertility on that last AI, the third AI, versus fertility in your bullpen, and you can kind of get a judge of, it's a rough estimate, it's by far not perfect, but you can kind of get a handle on what the fertility difference is. And a lot of times I've seen pretty large differences, and it may deem profitable for that dairy to continue to AI longer, and specifically in the summer months, but it might be true all around as well. So let's get into synchronization and timed AI. These studies that I'm going to show were done all out of Florida on commercial dairies, looking at utilizing full timed AI programs, that's no estrus detection, versus breeding on estrus during the summer months. And when they did this, they looked at timed AI is here in the red, and then BOE stands for bred on estrus. As you would expect, if you're doing a full timed AI program, you get 100% of your animals get inseminated, whereas if you're only detected in heat, you're going to have a lower portion of animals because some of them you're not going to find in estrus. In this particular study, they had a very low estrus detection rate, as low as 18 in Florida. If you look at conception rate, breeding on estrus had a better conception rate versus timed AI. However, because you didn't inseminate near as many animals, when you look at 120-day cumulative pregnancy rates here, you get higher number of animals that are pregnant versus those that were bred on estrus. So again, because our heat detection goes down, and the reason synchronization protocols came about was due to low estrus detection. Possibly in the summer, some dairies would want to consider not detecting an estrus and just going to full timed AI programs, possibly just for summer months. This same study also looked at days open for cows conceiving. The timed AI group had 78 days open average versus 90 days open average on those that were bred on estrus. And the interval to first service was much greater for those bred on estrus versus those timed AI. Again, just showing the effects that utilizing timed AI and being able to inseminate 100% of those animals, you can also will inseminate all of them possibly at an early rate versus trying to detect in estrus. These were both significant. Another study, again out of the University of Florida, looking at bred on estrus versus timed AI. There was 2 experiments within this. They did not see anything at first timed AI. However, if you look at 90 days cumulative pregnancy rates or 120 days, the timed AI groups were significantly better than bred on estrus. So it could be that utilizing these timed AI programs, I think more and more dairies have incorporated synchronization on their program, on their farms, and we have very robust programs today than what we did even when these studies were done 15, 20 years ago. And so possibly it could pay that at least during the summer months to just do full-time AI, and then maybe back off, and in the winter months you can go to an estrus detection program within your synchronization program, also known as cherry picking. So it might be something to consider a full-time AI program just through the summer months if one's not already doing that. Induced ovulation with GnRH at estrus. So this concept forms from the fact that progesterone, like a lot of our endocrine hormones, are severely reduced during the summer. In fact, the only endocrine hormone that I think I've shown evidence of really increasing during the summer months is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, which could be the reason why we have an increase in twinning rate sometimes through the summer. But in this particular instance, daily progesterone during spring and summer in Holstein cows, where they looked at, through the estrus cycle, animals that were not under heat stress versus animals that were heat stressed. And you can see that progesterone levels were reduced in the animals that were heat stressed versus those that were not heat stressed. We know that progesterone is very important for priming of the uterus and for maintaining a cow pregnant. So reducing progesterone would not be a good thing, and if anything, we would want to find ways to improve progesterone levels all the time, but specifically during the summer since they're reduced. This study by Mann in 1999 looked at progesterone levels for large and small embryos, and those embryos that were larger had higher progesterone levels in the bloodstream as well versus smaller embryos. In addition, because these embryos were larger, they had a large amount of interferon tau produced. Again, that important protein that blocks prostaglandin and maintains that CL that produces progesterone. So another important point to make is that reducing progesterone, we could have a reduced embryo size, in turn having reduced interferon tau production. That animal will produce prostaglandins, regress the CL, and come into heat. So what's some ways that we could possibly improve progesterone production? And again, specifically looking at summer, I went through the data to find anything in the summer months that we can utilize to produce progesterone, specifically utilizing GnRH, or even I'll speak here in a little bit on HCG, to cause ovulation and formation of a CL. In these particular studies, I have 3 studies listed here. This is the effects of GnRH when given at the time of estrus, when they catch this animal in heat and they breed this animal, on fertility in dairy cows during summer. And the first study in particular saw a 52% conception rate when GnRH was given at the time of AI, when the animal was bred in estrus, versus 35%. And then the study to the far right also saw a significant difference, 31% conception rate when given GnRH at the time of AI versus 21%. The particular study in the middle here had low number of animals. They did not see a significant difference. There was a numerical difference, but not a significant difference. And so that is something that throughout these next few slides I'm going to bring up, is there's somewhat of inconsistency in the data when it comes to looking at utilizing GnRH and HCG specifically post-AI. But in this particular case, 2 of the 3 studies saw significant improvements when using GnRH at the time of insemination. And the reason this could be is we know that ovulation failure is increased during summer months. So even though a cow might show an estrus, she doesn't necessarily ovulate to that estrus. So possibly giving an injection GnRH to induce that ovulation, we could have improved fertility. So what about inducing an accessory CL after AI? So I was specifically talking about at the time of AI, utilizing GnRH, but what if we went in 5 to 7 days or 12 days after AI and gave an injection of GnRH or HCG to induce an accessory CL? Could we improve progesterone levels? And how this works, and I received this slide from Dr. Bill Thatcher, but if you look at the estrus cycle, if a cow comes into heat and ovulates, estrogen levels drop. You then get the rise in progesterone because that CL is producing the progesterone. The cow has a follicular wave, so these follicles are growing. However, this large follicle does not ovulate due to the fact that you have high progesterone levels that will keep that animal from ovulating. You then get regression of that follicular wave, and you have a new follicular wave that begins. And estrogen levels begins to rise due to the fact that you have a large follicle. You get LH spikes. Hopefully estrogen will increase high enough to cause ovulation, and the cow will come into heat during this time period. So that's how the cycle of a dairy cow works. So if you were to then utilize a product such as HCG, and you give HCG here at, say, day 5, you hopefully cause ovulation of this dominant follicle. That ovulation will then form a CL, and you will get a rise in progesterone, additional rise in progesterone from the CL that maybe is already there. Same is true for GnRH. So HCG has LH-like activity. GnRH stimulates the release of LH. LH is luteinizing hormone, so it causes ovulation. So if you use GnRH at this time point, as long as that follicle is greater than 10 millimeters in size, you should get ovulation. And with that, you will get an increase in the amount of additional progesterone during this estrous cycle. Another time point would be out here at days 12, 13, 14, 15. Somewhere in there. Again, the follicle has to be big enough to respond to GnRH, but you would get increased levels of progesterone or progesterone that would stay longer, and it might be, if there was an embryo already there, then it will help stimulate the growth of that embryo during this particular time point of days 17, 18, 19 that I discussed earlier, to when we need an embryo to produce interferon tau, and we need progesterone available as well. So this is kind of the concept behind using post-AI hormonal therapy such as HCG or GnRH to induce ovulation and increase progesterone levels and hopefully fertility. So I'm just showing a couple of studies here adapted from Schmidt in 1996 where they used either GnRH or they use HCG, and if you look at progesterone levels, both of these, they used them around day 5, and you can see that progesterone levels in the control group are lower than progesterone levels in the group that received treatment, whether it be GnRH or HCG. The differences in this particular case of 11.7 nanograms per ml versus 8.5, and here is 18 nanograms per ml versus 9.7. So again, just showing that inducing ovulation will induce accessory CL and hopefully improve progesterone levels. So I went through the literature to find all the studies that did this specifically during the summer months. So this is the effect of either using HCG or GnRH on day 4 or 5 post-AI during summer on conception rates. And these are 4 particular studies here. Of these 4 studies, 2 of them had significantly improved conception rates when using either HCG or GnRH at day 4 or 5 versus the other 2 studies here that showed no significant improvement when using hormonal therapy post-AI at day 4 or day 5. So as I mentioned earlier, when going through the literature and looking at this particular technique, I did not see a true consistency with the literature that I found looking at it during summer. Some studies showed an improvement, some studies did not show an improvement. To look at looking at either giving GnRH on day 5 or at day 11 to 15 to catch that second follicular wave, post-AI during summer on conception rates. In this first study, they saw no differences in fertility. This was done in Florida, and they just looked at a control, which was no hormonal therapy post-AI, versus giving an injection of GnRH at somewhere between days 11 and 15 post-AI. However, the study done by Willard saw a tendency for an improvement, 19% conception rate versus an average of about 33-34% conception rate. And that's when these 2 groups were combined versus the control group. So some mild evidence here that given the GnRH days 11 through 15, specifically in the summer, possibly improved fertility, at least in one particular study. And then looking at what if we did both options. So what if we, at both on day 0 and then again on day 12, we gave a hormonal therapy to improve ovulation failure or ovulation rate and then turn around and induce an accessory CL. So 2 studies looked at this, and when they did, both of them showed a significant difference. The control group having a 42% conception rate in this particular study versus 49 for those that just received at day 0 and 52 for those that received at day 0 and 12. And then in the Lopez-Gadia study, again, they saw incremental improvements when they received GnRH injection at day 0, and then again day 0 and day 12. So there is some evidence that giving post-hormonal therapy or giving hormonal therapy at the time of AI, we can improve fertility during summer months in particular. However, again, I would caution you, just looking through the literature, there is some inconsistency, if you will, in what some of the results are. And so I tried to illustrate those today by the numerous studies that are up here, and some showing a positive effect and some not showing a positive effect. So to look at embryo manipulation and transfer, this will be the last studies that I go through. Days 1 through 7, I showed this slide earlier. We know the early growing embryo is more susceptible to heat stress. If we can utilize embryo transfer and transfer an embryo on day 7, we can possibly bypass this early time period and improve fertility. Several studies have looked at this, mainly at the University of Florida, and a lot of these were done in the late 80s and early 90s, looking at utilizing embryo transfer versus AI during the summer. They saw improvements with fresh embryos when utilizing superovulation, but frozen embryos, especially with IVF, they did not see the same results. So what we wanted to do in the study that I'm getting ready to show you is reevaluate this with today's current media, today's reproductive techniques, utilizing timed embryo transfer with the robust synchronization programs we have, and look to see if we can improve fertility specifically for the summer months. So the title of this study, which was published, actually it was published in 2011 by my graduate student Brandy Stewart, looking at the efficacy of embryo transfer in lactating dairy cows during summer using fresh and vitrified, which vitrified is just a technique for freezing, with sexed in vitro produced embryos. So if you're not familiar with the IVF embryo production system, this is how it works. What we did was went to the slaughter plant here in Stephenville, Texas. We received ovaries from Holstein dairy cows. We slashed those ovaries and got the eggs out, and only took good quality eggs of grades 1 or 2. We fertilized those, we matured them for 24 hours, then fertilized them and added sex-sorted semen. So we were able to take good quality sex semen to fertilize these embryos for 8 hours. We then cultured them in a media called BBH7. Once these embryos were grown up to the blastocyst stage, we then separated out the embryos, and some were frozen with vitrification. Others were then left fresh. We transported them to the farm, and they were transferred into the dairy cow. So the experimental procedures for this, the experimental design, we did this on 2 commercial freestall dairies in Central Texas. Both of these dairies were milking approximately 3,000 Holstein dairy cows. This was done from July to October 2009. We used both first calf heifers and multifarious animals, and we ended up utilizing 722 animals for this study. They were put into one of 3 treatment groups following a synchronized estrus. They were either AI'd with conventional semen on day 0, there's about 227 animals, or they received an embryo that had been vitrified and then transferred on day 7, 279 animals, or embryo transfer with fresh embryo on day 7, that was 216 animals. The synchronization and treatment protocol was pretty much standard on both farms. This is the AI group here. All animals had a chance to be heat detected. If they were shown in heat, they were AI'd and removed. If they did not find a heat, they rolled into the OVSync program, this OVSync 56, and then received a GnRH injection, and those animals were AI'd the next morning. And a blood sample was taken at this time. 1 week later, an ultrasound was done to check to make sure that they had a CO. The same thing was done for those in the embryo transfer group with vitrified embryos. And and embryo transfer with fresh embryos. So the exact same thing was utilized. The only thing that would have been different is during this time point in the two embryo groups, we obviously did not AI those animals. We just took a blood sample and skipped those animals. They were tail chalked a different color, so the farm knew not to AI them. And then 1 week later, if they had a CL, an embryo was put into these animals. And then pregnancy was diagnosed at day 40 and again at day 97. Plasma progesterone concentration was used to determine the conformation of a synchronized estrus. So on these next few slides, I'll show you synchronized animals and then all animals. So what I wanted to do was synchronized animals is if progesterone was less than 1 nanogram per ml on day 0, which was the day of a synchronized estrus, and they had a presence of a CL 7 days later when we were either transferring these embryos or if they were in the AI group, either one, that's what we called synchronized. The reason we look at this is because we don't want to give an advantage to the embryo group. So if the AI cows did not have a CL, they were excluded from this group the exact same as the embryo group. So to move on to the results, the day 40 pregnancy exams, this again is all cows. We had in the AI group an 18.3% pregnancy per AI versus 29% pregnancy per embryo transfer in the vitrified group and 42% in the fresh embryo group. So we saw a dramatic improvement here when utilizing embryos, whether it was vitrified embryos or fresh embryos. If you look at it in the synchronized cows, again, really the only main difference is the AI group here increases a little bit because, again, we remove all the animals that did not have a CL, just like we would if we were going to transfer an embryo. We only take cows that have a CL. So here you can see there were 23% pregnancy per AI in the control group, 31% pregnancy per AI in the vitrified group, and 45% in the fresh group. So this was very exciting to us to receive or to be able to achieve 45% or even 31% pregnancies per embryo versus the AI group during summer months here in Central Texas is pretty astounding. So we were pretty happy at this time. However, let's see what happens at day 97. So we went out a step further to look at pregnancy at day 97. Again, when we look at it in all cows, we see a significant improvement with embryo transfer with vitrified embryos, and our superior group was the fresh embryo group at 36% pregnancy per AI versus either 25 or 17. And these were all significantly different from each other. In the synchronized cows, however, because we have an improvement a little bit in AI because we removed the cows that don't have a CL, we no longer have a significant difference between AI and embryo transfer with vitrified embryos, but we still see a great improvement with the fresh embryos up here at 39% versus either 27 or 21. So we did lose the significant effect with our vitrified embryos, but this would be the first study, I think, that shows that we can achieve similar pregnancy rates with frozen IVF embryo transfers, at least specifically for the summer months. And then we got a double improvement when utilizing fresh embryos. So we wanted to follow these animals out to birth and look at total birth and total live birth. And when we did this, again, I have it separated by all cows and synchronized cows. So this would be your calving rate. So a 14.6% calving rate versus 20.1. There was no difference in calving rate in AI versus frozen embryos, but there was still that dramatic improvement in the fresh embryos of 31.2%. And the same is true for our synchronized cows as well. And then if you look at live births, again, still that same trend, 14.6 versus 17.1, so no difference between AI and frozen embryos, but again, a double in improvement from AI to the fresh embryos. So calving rate was, again, significantly improved in our embryo transfer with fresh embryos versus conventional AI. If you look at total heifers and live heifers, as you would expect, conventional AI, you achieve about a 50% total heifers. And since we were utilizing sex semen to produce our embryos in IVF, we received 80% in our vitrified group and 88% in our fresh group. So about an average of 84% calves hitting the ground were heifer calves, as one would expect. And this is the same is true for live heifers. We looked at, of those born, how many were live heifers, and so the same trend occurring. So not only do we greatly improve calving rate using fresh embryos, but also those that are calving, or higher percentage of those are heifers. So the take-home messages, my last slides here, to improve fertility during summer. I didn't go into this, but aggressive heat detection is always good. There's good heat detection aids out there. And more technology looking at ways to improve heat detection. As aggressive you can be there. Robust synchronization programs and timed AI programs. Just be careful with lockup times and compliance. Sometimes we can induce more heat stress than we're reducing. So being able to employ or implement a robust synchronization program and maybe doing full timed AI specifically during the summer months might help improve fertility as well. AI can improve fertility and genetic gain compared to bulls. Bulls can achieve acceptable pregnancy rates, but you must aggressively manage them. GnRH or ACG on or after AI may improve summer fertility. From what I've been able to see, results are a little bit inconsistent, so you might have to see what works on your dairy. And then last but not least, embryo transfer, we saw greatly improved fertility, at least with fresh embryos and the number of heifers born. Large-scale implementation can be very difficult. The farms that we did the embryo transfer on want this as part of their repro program, and so we're working hard to implement this on a commercial scale, but running into several challenges of making that happen, unfortunately. So need to improve fertility of the frozen embryos to really get around some of these logistical challenges of doing on-farm embryo transfer. We really need to be able to use frozen embryos. And from what I showed you, using vitrified or frozen embryos in an IVF system, we did not improve fertility in AI. So still some work needs to be done there to improve post-fall survival of our embryos. With that said, thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions. Again, this project was supported by USDA AFRI grant and a lot of collaborators involved, and appreciate that and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Todd. We have a couple questions on the use of HCG and GnRH and how long they're effective, and also have you ever looked at some economic analysis? Probably this may be more of a question for Albert.
Right, that's what I was thinking. I don't think Albert DeFries has even looked at that I'm aware of. I could be wrong, but I don't know of any economic analysis off the top of my head. Again, I'm thinking specifically for summer, where fertility is what the analysis would be. But you know, if we can show an improvement in fertility, it wouldn't take much to pay for that one injection of GnRH or HCG. During AI or post-AI. So the problem is the inconsistent results, and what do you use to use your economic analysis? Do we use the study that showed a great improvement, or do we use the study that showed no improvement? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that might be a question for Albert DeVries, but that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Might be a little premature is what you're saying. Need a little more research?
Right. I think utilizing the research that we have, it just depends on what study you pick. The study that you show a dramatic improvement, then I'm sure your economic analysis will come out in favor, but those that don't show an improvement, again, I'm sure the opposite would occur. So I think we need either more research or larger numbers, or somehow look at these large multi-site studies that we can take into account treatment by farm to see if what our results would be interesting.
Following up on that, I think there was one question they're asking how long these injections would be effective in the animal. Basically, how long do they last, I believe is what they were asking.
Yeah, I can't recall exact time off the top of my head. I know it's very short. I'm wanting to say within minutes. GnRH is gone from the bloodstream. The half-life on GnRH or some of these HCG, I know is really short. I can't recall an exact time off the top of my head.
Okay. Dr. Britt asked the question about, is there a difference between higher and lower conception rate bulls used in the summer? I believe he's talking about AI bulls. AI
Right. It's a good question. I don't recall a study looking at that, so I don't know that I could answer that question. If there is a study out there, I haven't seen it, but my guess would say possibly yes, but again, I don't recall the study if there's one out there that's looked at it.
Okay. Other questions. I see that we have someone typing. So if you were to set priorities, if you actually managed a herd, you can pick how many cows you want in this herd, and you were in an area that had heat stress, I'm going to ask you to answer the question for the southeast and then answer the question for more the, Iowa has as much heat stress as we do. Don't really think about that until I moved there and went to graduate school there. Then I figured out they also have heat stress. What would be your priorities as far as managing a reproductive program? What would you put into place in priority?
Number one thing is I would, to the hilt, put in a good cooling program. Shade, water, fans. And that would be my number one priority, is making sure that I cool, exit lane cooling, holding pin cooling. Holding pin's a key. That's a place that we always see heat stress. But evaporative cooling is the key. I run into people with just fans or just soakers. I think the point is to get the cow wet and then get that evaporated so that we can pull the heat out of the animal. So it's going to take the combination of the two, both air movement and water spray. So that would be the first and foremost thing I would do, whether it be in Iowa or Texas.
How many hours a day would you do it?
Wow, that's a good question. I would try to set it by the THI or temperature, and I would have it coming on at a THI of around 68. So fairly cool. You're looking at, 70 degrees out. So if it's above that, I would have that system running at all times.
Mm-hmm. You have somebody else typing a question. How about up further north? Would you do the same thing?
Yeah, that's tricky. I would really look at it up north and see what the effects. If we're talking up north, like northern Minnesota, Canadian line, I don't know if you can justify putting as much of a cost or putting as much money into a full to the hilt cooling system, but I still would say that there are some areas that you would need cooling, such as the holding pin, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we had a comment in there about LH surge. Lasts about 4 to 5 hours after GnRH injection, whereas HCG remains in the blood for up to 66 hours after injection, with a peak between 7 and 9 hours after injection. Any comments regarding that?
No, I couldn't remember the numbers off the top of my head, so.
Any other? We got somebody typing, so we'll wait a few seconds and see what comes through. Again, please go ahead and do the survey. We greatly appreciate those comments. Are real important to us. Okay, the question is the number of animals or significant difference between the studies with significant and not? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I know I think he's saying were the studies that did not have a significant difference, was it because they had a low number of animals?
Okay.
I think that's what he's saying. And that's a great question. Yes, there were several of those that were, but with that said, there was a couple of those studies that had some pretty good numbers in them and did not see a difference between the two. But yeah, a couple of those studies, to answer your question, a couple of those studies I think was just directly due to low numbers. So it's a good point. But also, if I go out without, if I take summer out of the picture, so again, I was just showing you summer. They did a pretty big meta-analysis. It's got, I don't know, 15 or 20 studies in it looking at giving GnRH post-AI to see if they can improve fertility. And when they did that, they saw the same inconsistency that I was kind of looking at in the literature for summer with you know, some studies they saw an improvement, some they did not see any. Overall, there was, when you collectively put all those studies together, I think there was about a 3 percentage unit improvement when using a post-AI therapy, such as GnRH, versus not using it. So, again, I still think it's inconsistent out there.
Well, I think that's all of our questions, Todd. We thank you for doing this, and we greatly appreciate your expertise, and hopefully we will do a better job of managing heat stress when it comes to summer.